Hey there, welcome to the Agentic Voice Podcast, where we explore topics related to vocal freedom and trauma-informed voice care. My name is Kristen Ruiz, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Geneva, Mayne. And our guest today is fellow singing voice specialist, Mayne Durham. So we are so excited to have you here, Mayne. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing ideas around dignity and voice, along with some short somatic practices you can start implementing right away. So let me tell you a little bit about Mayne's bio. So Mayne serves on the voice faculty at the University of Louisville and works as a singing voice specialist, where she collaborates with medical professionals to rehabilitate singers who have experienced vocal injury. She incorporates a trauma-informed approach to voice care and facilitates movement for trauma, yoga voice, life force yoga, and transcending sexual trauma through yoga. Mayne is a member of the Voice and Trauma Research and Connection Group and is a frequent clinician for choral and vocal groups throughout the country, including the National Association of Teachers of Singing, VATSA, Vocology in Practice, the Voice Foundation, and the American Choral Directors Association. So Mayne, thank you so much for joining us today.
So glad to have you. I've been looking forward to this. We had wanted to have you in the fall, but we couldn't get our schedules to jive. So we're so excited to start out this year with you. Our first segment is What's New and What's Good. And I have nothing new and good to share, guys. I have been a literal blob. I haven't been doing anything.
So is the good getting some well-deserved rest?
I guess. I'm like, I haven't gone anywhere. I haven't gone out. I'm just chilling, Netflixing. And I'm enjoying that unashamedly.
I think, the laws of the harvest, there's a time to like rest the field, right? So I think the good thing, Geneva, might be just taking some time to relax that nervous system. Yeah, decompress, regroup.
Yeah.
So as a mom of two, we were talking before we started recording, but as a mom of two small children, your what's new and what's good sounds amazing.
Oh my goodness. Mayne, what's good or what's new with you?
Thank you so much for asking. I think this is a lovely way to start. So I feel like in this particular moment, I am feeling grateful for connection and a general sense of community. I think in both my professional and personal lives, I felt isolated for a really long time. I think a lot of people resonate with that. COVID, and also again, as a parent, that comes into my life quite frequently. And I'm so grateful for colleagues lately that I've been able to connect with that offer affirmation, but also accountability. People that I can go to get whose view I really respect and whose view might challenge me, which is always a little uncomfortable sometimes, but I think is so necessary, particularly in the work that we're unpacking today. So I think what's new and what's good is that I'm feeling not alone.
Nice. That's important.
That is good.
Yeah.
That is good. We used to joke around with some other voice teachers and say, like, we all feel like we're in our studio caves. Like you stay in the cave because you're all like, a lot of us are doing a lot of one-to-one or in small groups and that kind of thing. And like you peek your head out and you're like, is there an outside world? So any kind of chance for collaboration, connection, oh my goodness, and iron sharpens iron, right? Every time we have a conversation, we're stretched. So my what's good and what's new, actually, Mayne, is cousins of what you're talking about. Like I'm really appreciating the connection with colleagues. So, we got to do our last podcast episode was streaming with Pava. So that was a great experience. We got to meet some new people in the field who were just as, passionate about, freeing singers. A friend of mine says, free people, right? So, it's a work of light when we allow it to be. So it was great to stream with them. And I've been working with my team, and we've been innovating exploring new strategies, new iterations of ways to train singers that, it's about being as effective and efficient and life-giving as we can, and just keep taking those steps. So it's that, for me, it's really celebrating, passionate colleagues. So that's kind of where I am, because we're watching the results of that, and the ripple effects have been very empowering and life-giving, as opposed to disempowering and the kinds of energies that take energy away. So that's where I am. Yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah. So let's jump in. Megan, your work clearly involves a trauma-informed approach, right, to voice. And you've had a paper recently published in the Journal of Singing. And I need to say, especially for those who have not had the opportunity to read it yet, I was really struck by the holistic way that you wove the research together for this piece. Like, you presented a lens of interdisciplinarity that you wove it in a cohesive way that shifts the camera angle onto aspects of the singing experience that, at least in my experience, has often fallen into the shadows. So I want to share a couple little nuggets from that piece, and how I thought it was really interesting. You talked about the physiology and the nervous system, but you also included references to forces and contributing factors beyond physiology, even beyond cognition and matters of our own will. So for instance, when you said, like, so-called vocal faults come up, you said these can be habituated involuntary nervous system responses, so that idea of vocal faults, not just being the fault themselves, but saying that these are involuntary nervous system responses that have been habituated. And then you said we can reframe how we interact with all singing bodies, treating any response with dignity and reverence. And so I think that that idea of, like, when a vocal fault comes up, so-called, that recognizing that there's a lot of contributing factors to that beyond just cognition, will, desire, and the things within our immediate touch, right? And then you touched on issues of identity. And I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but it actually echoed of transformative learning theory and Robert Kegan's constructive development theory. It's the impact of our identity, our sense of ourself, and the power that holds. And you said it is acknowledging multiple truths about our body. Like, I have an injury and I am resilient, so that I am resilient, I am, versus I have. So in cognitive development theory, it talks about, like, there's things that we are, and then there's things that we can behold. And I thought it was interesting that you unpacked that. And you also said the multiple truths would be, like, in our mind, like, I experience depression and I am powerful, that these can coexist. And you said, and our voice, I feel afraid to sing, and my voice has agency. And that word caught my attention. So, but that idea that there can be multiple truths in our body, and honoring what we are experiencing and who we are, and not always, and just kind of acknowledging the relationship between those. I thought that was interesting. And then you noted the meaning making lens of the voice care worker, because all of us are meaning making machines. And this part reminded me of Dr. Dweck's work on growth mindset research. You said, to a trauma informed voice teacher, each student provides a new opportunity to learn, to stumble, to apologize when harm has been done, and perhaps most importantly, to do our own work of self-realization and accountability. So there's really this idea of not a fixed mindset, and that we have to be, scared of new experiences, but to take each opportunity to grow and stumble and learn and look at ourselves and I think while we're developing the singing voice, there's also our own voice, our own personhood that's developing. And then the last piece that I was like, oh my goodness, we need to go out for some tea or something. Another piece of the puzzle that you said, actually literally you said, another piece of the puzzle is recognizing our position of power. And in the conclusion, you said, we can make considered choices about how our words and practices invite well-being, continually affirming that all bodies, all voices deserve to take up physical and acoustic space. If that didn't get a loud amen from me, like no, like it absolutely did. And it kind of echoes of social constructivist theories and Foucault's theory of power, where they propose that knowledge and power are intimately bound together, and that we need to look at these power systems just inherent in the learning process. So I just thought that the holistic lens, the trauma-informed lens, was super interesting, how there was actually many pieces woven together, really stretching us to a new understanding. So Megan, I need to ask, since a lot of us didn't come to this information, in our undergrad or grad training, right? Like we trip into it elsewhere. So can you share a little bit, how did you get interested in this kind of work?
Thank you so much for reflecting all of that back. I kind of just want to name in my body. It's like, I'm one of those people that receiving the way that you so gifted to me is really warm and also hard sometimes to hear reflected back so beautifully. So I'm really quite grateful. I did not set out to, I think like a lot of us, I really didn't set out to offer trauma-informed work so much as it unfolded as part of my own personal journey. It definitely started with me finding ways for me to reconnect and remember parts of myself, that parts of my identity. And then I think, so first and foremost, the tools that I have gathered are things that I have found integrative in my own experience. And then having sort of said that as a scaffolding, after I got my master's degree, I began practicing and studying the sacred teaching in yoga, and which sort of led me down one personal path of integration. And at the same time, I was training with Dr. Karen Wickland, who has since passed, to become a singing voice specialist. And as I began working with folks that were really navigating vocal injury, it started to become clear that a lot of the folks that I was working with were experiencing and self-reporting chronic stress and PTSD. And I felt like I needed more ways to offer them a particular kind of resource. First and foremost, I needed to offer myself resource so that I had capacity to be uncomfortable. And I'll just kind of name from the beginning, when people ask me, oh, are you trauma informed? I say, I don't know. That's for you to choose, because I think this work is relational. You cannot do it in isolation. And so I honestly don't know. I try to be as resourced as possible. I try to have information. And then my biggest task in this is sitting in the muck and sitting in the mess without having an answer all the time. And so I needed resource for myself.
I like that point, Megan. I'm just going to jump into that.
Yeah,
just because the idea of I can be trauma informed for some people, but not for others, depending on what I know about their lived experience or how I can understand their experiences. I think that it's relational, and it has to do with what the person who you're working with thinks about your knowledge and skill set. It's humble, it's humility. And I think when we're working towards cultural humility, knowing that everyone comes with their own set of cultural facets, recognizing that you might be trauma informed for some people, but not for others, is hugely legit.
Yeah, and it shifts the power. It becomes more egalitarian if we can embrace that idea that trauma informed is a co-created, experience. Yeah,
definitely. It's so wonderful to be in a space like this where we can take that thread and pull on it. Because I do think that often, like, trauma is, unfortunately, it sells. It's very trendy right now, particularly in Instagram therapy. And if you don't see me, I'm doing air quotes. And I think it really trivializes folks who are living with the very real pain of PTSD and CPTSD to, it's not a certification that we get in a weekend. Let's just put it that way. It's just an ongoing journey of mess and stumble and repair. In fact, sometimes I sort of think, everybody likes to talk about safety. And Geneva, to your point, we can't guarantee safety. That is a big ask too. That's a big thing to try to shoulder. And so I think for me, what I'm interested in is offering repair when it's necessary. And kind of where I am right now is offering not necessarily a safe space, but a play space, which doesn't bypass the pain. And in fact, going back to that both and, we can honor the experience that's happening right now, and then find together ways to come back into the body and reorient and remember singing as a source of joy. So trauma, the word rarely really ends up in the space that I work. Joy and awe, those words are usually what end up entering the space.
Nice. So tell us a little bit more about your journey into this work. So,
well, let's see. After graduate school, so I was doing my singing voice certification the same time I was practicing yoga, and again, seeing that I needed to find more resource for everyone involved. And that led me down a couple different paths. I have several backgrounds in yoga. Life Force yoga I'll highlight because it's primarily for anxiety, depression, and trauma. And then from there, I studied with Zabi Yamasaki, who has a really wonderful program, yoga specifically for sexual trauma. And then after that, I studied with Jane Clapp and her work in movement for trauma. And we'll probably name her as well as a couple others today as we go along.
So I think what I would really want listeners to understand, that part of what most people would agree being trauma informed is that one of the big things is that once you begin to really understand the scope and the prevalence of trauma and adverse experiences that people are going through, and you begin to even, take that lens with yourself and realize what you've passed through and how it's affected your relationships. One of the things that a lot of trauma-informed people do is they start equipping themselves so that they can be helpful of service to other people. It's just like a natural progression. So it's not something where you get to a point and you're saying, I'm trauma-informed, going back to that first point that I really liked, because you're constantly looking for that next thing that can, help you to, bring safety, quote unquote, and joy and peace to other people, because we can all relate to, the distress of, an adverse or traumatic experience. And, for many of us, that empathetic drive says, how can I make it easier for someone else? And so I think that's one of the core pieces of being trauma informed, is just equipping yourself to create spaces for people where they can at least begin to feel safe, that they can begin to feel joy and peace and things like that. So, as you're talking about your journey, how long did all of that take? Because that list sounds like a lot of things. It sounds like more than a degree, actually.
Probably about 15 years I've been going on. I feel like I'm a giant sponge. I love how you worded that. And I soak it up and then I wring it out. And that's a little flippant. So, but I do think I love what you said, Geneva. It really is just a constant journey of gathering and receiving and holding and giving away and doing it all again.
Right. Awesome.
It's kind of like curating,
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love that you quoted Stacey Haynes with saying that, it's about safety, belonging, and dignity. And I think that just to keep looking for ways to enhance and amplify these ideas of safety, belonging, and dignity.
I'm wondering, I don't want to jump ahead too soon, but because of that word dignity, it sort of keeps popping up a lot. I'm wondering if it would feel fun, and I always sort of use that, where no is always celebrated. So if someone's listening and this would not feel fun, then please choose no. But if it would feel fun, I'm wondering if we might engage in a bit of a a somatic practice around the word dignity. And I want to name that this practice was taught to me, was communicated to me through a really brilliant somatic practitioner, Kai Cheng Thom. I'll put a link. I think we can add that to the notes. Kai Cheng Thom is just a really prolific writer and trans justice activist, among so many other things. So I want to honor her as I share this. So if it feels right for you in this moment, we'll start by getting more comfortable. What is more comfortable like in this moment for you? I'm going to slouch because that feels more comfortable to me. And then in any gesture that feels right, I'm going to invite you to breathe into the word dignity. And as we breathe into the word dignity, maybe there is an upward moving gesture with the palms, with the arms, or with the hands, perhaps subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, lifting the arms upward. Noticing what it's like to rest in dignity, to breathe in dignity, to move in dignity. Perhaps there's a color or an image that's coming into your mind. And then from here, I'll invite us to turn our palms downward, perhaps finding the ground, pressing into the ground with the toes, or perhaps pressing into the tops of the thighs, if that's available, with the hands. Breathing now into the word humility. Sensing into the word humility in the body. Again, maybe a color or an image or a felt sense or a movement comes to mind. And then once more, turning the palms upward, opening the heart center, going back to our space of dignity. Going back here, remembering dignity in the body, asking ourselves, can I find humility here as well? Can I bring humility into my dignity? Can I pull that up here? Can they both coexist? And then finally turning the palms downward, going back into the gesture of humility, remembering that initial feeling, asking, can I find dignity here? Can I bring dignity upward into my humility? I can rest in both my worth and my humbleness. And when you're ready, returning back into our shared space.
That was so powerful.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yep. You know, when we were doing this, the dignity, the upward gestures, I immediately felt royal. Honestly, I had like this idea of myself as a queen. Seriously, like I'm in my little chair in my office, but it became a throne.
I could
And
see
everything
Geneva
was
as a
purple
queen.
and gold. Purple, black, and gold. I mean, it was just like awesome.
I see it.
It's amazing.
And the
Yes.
co-informing of those two energies that in some ways can be, unpacked as separate, but then weaving them together and letting them interact and blend. Powerful thoughts.
Yeah. And it strikes me, even though it was very much a somatic practice with us focusing on breath and our bodies, there was the mindful awareness of those concepts, which I think is so important for people who have experienced adversity or trauma, because often there's this feeling of inferiority and why me, and shaking of the self-esteem and things that come along with, and shame. We've talked about shame before in our
Yeah.
podcast. These things can often come along with trauma. So helping people to kind of reflect on those powerful concepts of your inherent dignity as a human being, you know, and dignity doesn't mean that you have to act like you're better than other people. You know, it does come with humility because you recognize the inherent dignity of everyone around you. I think that's just a very powerful practice. I really enjoyed that one.
The
Oh,
other
I'm so
piece
glad.
is I'm always fascinated with when there's challenges in the body, in the mind, how physiology also can be part of the pathway to healing and restoration and reconciliation.
Hmm.
So I think even the motion of the physicalization and using physiology to
Hmm.
talk to the parts of the system that are beyond cognition. I think there's so much more to be learned in that sphere. So thank you for bringing that, a taste of that in, because I think
Oh, you're welcome.
there might be a new frontier in there, you know?
Yes.
So was the person who created this, I can't remember the name,
Hmm.
was this person a somatic experiencing practitioner?
I believe Kai Cheng, I don't want to say too much. I'd have to go back and I'm sure that there are some. I feel like there is some somatic experiencing, but Kai Cheng has studied extensively. I believe practiced as a therapist at one time,
Gotcha.
um, but we can include the link to her work, which is incredibly powerful. She does a lot of conflict resolution, a lot of what's named as sexological body work, which is um, around consent, actually, coming from sort of the sex work tradition, and how we can how we can learn from that really unique and beautiful and empowered world. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there. So I would encourage you to check out her information.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing her work forward.
So one of the reasons that the dignity practice kind of comes to my mind is when I think about an agentic practice,
Mhm.
when I think about particularly drawing out the trauma-informed principle of empowerment, voice, and choice, um, I think particularly around offering choices, my mind centers first on this idea of dignity, because and sort of how can we offer vocal dignity? Um, I think we are not going to answer this question today, so spoiler. But I think I think in order to offer choice in the first place, in
Mhm.
order to see consent as a spectrum, not a binary yes and no, but a continual conversation in relationship, is really to be able to first honor someone's personhood. I love the Audre Lorde quotation that it's not our differences that divide us, but our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So I think first, really leaning into this idea that dignity honors difference, so that when we're able to honor that difference in voices, in bodies, in cultures, that my yes may be someone else's no way, right? We are then able to offer a more authentic choice in the first place. Then I think from their consent is a conversation around me getting curious about what choices you might make, and then being secure enough in my own embodied knowing to handle your choices, right? Particularly when they're different than mine, particularly when there's conflict, particularly when your choice is no. Um, so I think for me, offering empowered choices, offering consent, is first knowing what yes and no feel like in my body, so that I can more clearly offer that and receive that from others.
That's interesting because I was speaking with a friend just in the last week about no.
Mm,
And he said to me, your no feels like a rejection.
mm,
And I said, wow, but I'm still here. I haven't gone anywhere. And I don't know why my no feels like a rejection to you, but it's not. It's just a no. And no is such a loaded thing for people, right?
And I want to be really clear. I'm fascinated by this because it's really hard for me, Geneva. I am somebody who experiences no as a deep personal wound. Even if you say, no, Megan, I don't want that cupcake that you made, you know? So I want to be really clear. This is something I really deeply struggle with. So, yeah. But I think when I think about, to kind of, I guess, tail into the singing space specifically, or really the clinical space. I mean, as a speech pathologist, the Western classical voice lineage, I think, has a real long history of non-consensual pedagogy, unfortunately, and this discourse is really being highlighted by a lot of places now. But that sort of historical master-apprentice model, this is something I think about a lot. It often operates under an assumed deficiency paradigm. So we sort of assume in this model historically that the purpose of a voice lesson is to walk in and then walk out somehow different than we are, and that we are in need of fixing, and that our voices need to change to be better, and that someone who doesn't inhabit our singing body has that knowledge. That someone has this like omniscience over my body, that I don't have. So I'm really fascinated by this idea of like, what messages are our bodies and our voices constantly internalizing when we're asking, what do I need to optimize all the time, without also asking what's present now. And I think I'll bring another person into this. So Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's just another just really wonderful writer, has a great phrase that dignity, the opposite of dignity is dominance. Mm-hmm. And I think historical models of teaching voice often celebrate this normative sort of sound hegemony, where everything is sort of the same. We're not honoring this difference at all. In fact, we're trying to make everyone sort of this mold, right? And I think that viewing voice work is it's so ubiquitous to think of it this way that most people don't think to question it. That they do have choice, they do have agency, and that the voice teacher is not in charge of the student's body. And that power over structure, again, not allowing for difference, and really not honoring the personhood of the folks that we're working with.
Nice. How do you reconcile this? Because when I think about, singers who they're wanting to express something that sounds on the outside the way they feel it on the inside, right? And then and at some point, sometimes there's obstacles in their way. Maybe it's a technical, physiological, acoustical issue, or it could be mindset, it could be all kinds of different things that could cause that. So the idea of, saying, hey, like, where does the role of like helping somebody find free function, how does that align with saying, I'm stepping back and, you get to make all the choices? Like, how do those fit together, or how do you see them fitting together?
That's a great question. And there's so many wonderful people talking about this. I'll name Shannon Coates as one that I know does a lot of work around this topic. And I think if I could take a step back for a moment and then kind of come back, I think, to your question, which ultimately I think we're going to co-creation around this. But I think often when we talk about choice and consent, the conversation centers on touch, which can be certainly very impactful. In my own teaching, I don't touch my students for a lot of reasons. I'm not saying other people shouldn't, but that's my choice. And certainly in clinical sessions, massage and all these things can be really quite healing. But I think this conversation of offering consent, offering choices, goes way beyond touch. I think consent in the singing voice space extends to our intentions. So what is my intention as a singer, as a teacher, about the space that I'm creating, and the sound building process and the skill building process? Whose goals am I honoring with this exercise, right? Insert anything, right? Choosing repertoire, especially when we're asking bodies to move in new ways, when we're inviting a new somatic practice, when we're inviting a new vocalese, so when we're inviting, anything that might be coming to your mind. I think asking bodies to do new things is particularly tricky when there has been trauma. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think, Kristen, I don't have a great answer, but I think something that's coming to my mind now is that when we're operating from a consensual place, a place that invites folks into a co-creative learning process, is that what we are doing? Or are we operating from coercion, where the learning is actually just compliance to and for the dominant power in the room?
I think that's really powerful. That idea of like dominance, compliance. I think a lot of us can think of training experiences where those were the operating energies in the space, as opposed to something more egalitarian, co-created, and where it's kind of like all the stuff is put out on the table and you work it out together. Of like where things are going to go. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, some people don't believe coercion is there if the person has complied. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just curious because, if the person goes along or agrees, and is it coercion or did they exercise agency and choice? What are your thoughts on that? I think it's a hard question.
That's a really hard question. And I guess I would have to go to embodied knowing, and sort of this concept that often is tossed about in the polyvagal world of neuroception. And is my body, not my head, not the story in my head saying yes or no, but what is my body saying? And I think this is why we think of consent on a spectrum, because sometimes my body is saying absolutely, and my head is saying that is not a good idea, or vice versa, right? And everything in between. So I do not have an answer. I rarely have answers. I live in questions most of my life, but I do think going to the body first and saying, if a student says no to me, which I usually celebrate all the time. In fact, it's a little bit of a running joke in my studio, but I'm always known to say, please say no. Let's celebrate no, which is also really hard for some people at first, and may always be hard. But what's interesting is if someone says no, one question I often reflect back is what in your body is saying no to you that makes you verbalize that, so that there's this check-in somatically as well as cognitively. I'm not sure if that gets at it at all, but I think just being aware that there could be conflict between those things, particularly when it comes to issues of compliance. My head is saying this, my clinician is telling me to do this, but my body is saying, I don't know about that. Can we have a conversation about that? I think is kind of what we're saying. Maybe not an answer, but a conversation.
Yeah, conversation is surely important. And I'm sorry I cut you off, Kristen, but I wanted to say this point. I really like that you're cluing us in on thinking about the embodied choice. What is the body saying? Because, certainly we don't share nervous systems. I don't know if your body's telling you yes or no. But, we can read facial expressions and body languages, and we can certainly create spaces where people feel safe to express, what they're thinking and feeling. Certainly as the people in positions of power, as clinicians and practitioners, we need to create those spaces where people feel comfortable to say yes or no.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of I had a colleague once who was talking about going back into a toxic work environment, and as she was talking about going back in, she had an opportunity to choose, like, to go do it or to choose something else. And as she's talking about going back, literally I'm watching her, like, her actual physical structure was getting smaller and smaller.
She was contracting.
contracting in the most literal sense.
Yes.
And at the end I said, I hear you saying that you're going to go back. I just want you to check in with your body because it might have a different opinion. Just you do that check in, but I literally watched her go in. But the other thing that I thought, Megan, that you brought up was, which is super interesting, as an adjunct thought to what Geneva asked about, is compliance, is that agency because they made the choice, and it makes me think about, the privilege of being the one in power, because and that's where, you brought in humility, that idea of dignity and humility. And I think, as for those who really do care about connecting and being honoring of the human souls around us, to continually hone and nourish that sense of humility, saying, like, even as I'm trying to make this as equal and co-created as possible, there's still an element where, if you're the leader in the room, there's an element of power there, and to not assume, and to, I think that idea of, that privilege of having that power in the space requires us to take the onus of responsibility, to say, hey, really checking in with our bodies and with the verbal and visual cues that we're getting, is that compliance, or is that truly agency, and really unpack the difference between them. So, and you're the one who brought that thought to our minds. Yeah.
There's and I've so many of my thoughts are really, because I've had the privilege to learn from some really wonderful folks. I'm going to name Betty Martin, who I have not studied with, but she has a wonderful book called The Wheel of Consent. She's a somatic sex educator, and one of the questions that she often asks is, what are we doing and who is it for?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really speaks to to the dignity and humility piece. And I often come back to that, even in small things, even repertoire choices, or I don't know, like crafting a syllabus, or anything, any task I might do in the smallest way. What am I doing and who is this for? And I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, oh, that's for me, is often what's coming into my mind. And if it is for me, that's not always a bad thing, but it's important for me to have a conversation with myself about that. So I offer that because it's been a really helpful framework for my own work.
Yes, and I think, as it's a question that everyone should ask themselves, whether you are in the position of power or whether you're not, because as people who experience adversity or trauma, sometimes there's that people-pleasing response that kicks in, where for your own safety, you feel like you have to keep the peace and comply and make everyone happy and don't, ruffle any feathers. And so that response can be very, very much trained in people. So it's a great question. Who is this for? Is it for me, or is it for someone else that I'm trying to make happy?
Yeah. And when we've experienced trauma, there's often great wisdom in not being able to say or feel into yes or no, depending upon which of those was the protective and necessary strategy for survival. So yeah, that both can be very tricky to give and receive, I think.
Yeah. Well, mobility of language, mobility physically, that can be in question for somebody who's experienced trauma.
This was a great conversation, and we have to wrap up, unfortunately. So to kind of end up our episode, do you mind leading us in another somatic practice before I give the closing?
I'd love to. And this, we'll do it relatively quickly in our time today, but I encourage you to maybe do it again at another time if it feels like you'd like to go slower. This practice was inspired by also Kai Cheng Thom and Jane Clapp, who I mentioned earlier, who is a Jungian somatic practitioner. So more comfortable is always the invitation to start. Whatever more comfortable feels like in the body in this moment. And if it feels fun, I invite you to engage in this practice. When you're ready, breathe into the word yes. Breathing into the word yes in the body, taking your time. Are there any sensations, images, or colors that come up for you? Noticing if your body wants to open or close, or if movement feels invited with the word yes. Yes. And then next, breathing into the word no. No. If it feels helpful in any of these, you might even speak them aloud or to yourself. Noticing any images or colors or movement, if the body wants to open to no or wants to close. And finally, breathing into the word maybe. Maybe. And sometimes maybe is a placeholder because we need time, and other times maybe is actually no, but we need time to figure out how to communicate that. How does my body open or close to the word maybe? Inhaling to the crown of the head, I am. Exhaling to the soles of the feet, here. And returning to our shared space.
That was great. I love these.
Mhm.
For me,
so
the
glad.
yes felt joyful and the no felt powerful. Yeah. All right. So I'm just gonna do a quick plug because I know that you and Carol Kristen are going to do some kind of a workshop soon. It's coming up, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I can. It's on Saturday, so really soon. But we will hopefully offer it again. We're doing a workshop leaning into discomfort, which is actually very similar to some of the things we talked about today. Noticing how yes and no, particularly no, shows up when we're working with students or clients. That sort of that discomfort of I'm not sure what to do right now in my body. Noticing that and having some tools to navigate that.
Cool. All right. So let me jump into the closing. In this episode, we talked about how empowerment, voice, and choice are a key principle of a trauma-informed voice care and what this looks like in the singing studio. When we empower our students or clients by providing choices, we are building upon their individual strengths and experiences and sharing decision-making. We also engaged in some somatic practice around the concepts of dignity, humility, and consent. That was great. Thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you,
Thank you all
Megan.
so much. It was an honor to be here.
Oh, this
Take
is
care.